just to give the best plug ever. The most recent being Captain Jim, the fiddler, Ned Corvan, Life and Song. And that's what the subject is going to talk about tonight. But before I move on, just to draw your attention to the fact that it's also going to be involved in a play which will be held on the 25th, 26th, 27th of May. Yeah, in the Durham Theatre, the Gala Theatre in Durham, which is based on the book itself. But without any more ado, I think most people would rather hear Dave than me wax lyrically, but I thought I'd put all these medals up before he stands up.
He's not standing up, his hips going.
Oh.
Right?
Absolutely,
Right,
on you go.
Ned Corvan, the most important Tyneside singer-songwriter of all time, in my book. Been studying this man for 50 years. And of course, he was a typical Geordie. He was born somewhere else. It's true then and it's true now. Just tell from my voice, right? He was born in Liverpool. His parents were Irish Catholics. They had one son when they came across, and we can't find any more because of the British artillery. Easter 1916, the British artillery bombed all of the records of Irish lineage. So people over there have a real problem unless they have access to church records. Yeah? We haven't found them. They were called Margaret and Matthew, and the lad was called Matthew Senior, Junior. Ned was born in 1827. Don't believe a word of anything in Thomas Allen's book. He got almost all of it wrong. Yeah? Allen's Tyneside songs. And his father was a stonemason. So sometime in the early 30s, he came here. You probably know why, yeah? Early 30s. Certainly 1834, he was here by then, because Richard Granger had bought the middle of Newcastle, as it was, yeah, Anderson Place, and he wanted stonemasons. In fact, he wanted 2,000 workers, and the word must have got to Liverpool. They lived in Coburg Stairs. Anybody know where that was? That's what it's. Well, all you rich people who go to Cafe 21 yeah, in Bandon, we think, we're not certain, because the map sounds accurate enough, it was there, and it was socially divided. We think that the Corvans, they were called, not Corvan, yeah. We think they were North of Ireland, because there's lots of Corvins there now, but it's not certain, and we may never know. But up the hill were the poor Irish from the south, and relations weren't necessarily friendly most of the time, but occasionally they clung together. Right, so right through the 30s, when Ned's growing up, so that's the name they gave him, Ned. His dad was busy. Come 1839, the thing's finished. It's all finished, the centre of Newcastle, just about, father shouted, yeah. And Ned's dad dies 2 years later. On the death certificate it says bricklayer. Yeah. He was the grand old age of 49. He died of cancer of the mouth. And he had an operation in the infirmary. You know about the old infirmary, not far from the central surgery. He operated on things very like a kitchen table. And somebody before him had part of his jaw removed while he was still conscious because there were no, it hadn't been invented yet. So he had some beef tea afterwards. And then he died. And that's what Ned's dad went through. Probably went through something very similar indeed. It was brutal. Yeah, chloroform wasn't invented until a few years later. Thank goodness. So it's quite a thriving town. Wasn't the city until 1882, as you all know, it was a town, and it actually had its own forms of entertainment. And the one that you'll all know is Bambra's, just down the street here. Yeah, Bambra's Wheat Sheaf Inn, and it was respectable. It held 800 people at this time in the 1840s, but then they invented railways, didn't they? And London stars came up, and it got more and more respectable. And local artists who are marginalised begin to be marginalised in this town. Now, Ned was a big fan of Billy Purvis. People know about Billy Purvis, the travelling showman. Yeah. And the only letter from Ned we've got that survives said he ran away from home with a strolling player before he'd finished his apprenticeship as a sailmaker. Sailmaking was boring. Billy was exciting, yeah? In that company, he had virtually no acting parts. It was the 20-minute Shakespeare and a farce and a song in between, yeah? 20 minutes in, 20 minutes out, that was the deal. But he learned to paint scenery. He learned to dish out leaflets. His skills from a sailmaker would have helped with the canvas roof, yeah? He was useful in that sense. And he must have started writing songs. When he started to learn the fiddle, don't know. But he certainly knew how to play the fiddle by the end of the 1840s. He played it very, very well indeed. In fact, his name was that. What is he now? He's 21, yeah? 1848. His fame spread as far as Carlisle. See, there'd been a railway since 1838, yeah? It wasn't as remote as you might think. And Stagshaw Bank Fair was in between, one of the biggest fairs in England, yeah? And the drovers came from what's now Westmoreland and Cumberland, as well as from Europe. They came from just south of Middlesbrough, Ackland, what you came from, yeah? We found out. Anyway, Jimmy McKenny he was called. He was he was a weaver by trade, and he played in the parts of Carlisle where the Chartists had been organising. This cannot be accidental, I thought, yeah. He eventually gets a little group of people around him and gets kids involved as kind of a small company, and then he died. He died in 1848, and his friends asked Ned Corvan, yeah, to write a song for him. And it was called, surprise, surprise, Jimmy McKenny. My friend over there has written quite a bit about this. Now, there's a problem with being a travelling show person in this period, and the problem is called the roads. You can't go on the roads with the big heavy cart and horses after about November, or much before March, yeah? So what do travelling people do in the winter? They don't travel by and large. Eventually, Billy goes and books theatres and things like that, but at this point, Ned started getting gigs, and the way he characterised it was at concerts and places of amusement. So we don't know what that means, in other words. It could have been something like Bambers, it could have been the long room of a pub, it could have been anything really, yeah? Just where a lot of people used to get together and listen to somebody singing and playing the fiddle. And that would have been true right across the entire north of England, Lowland Scotland. That was Billy's remit. He travelled from as far north as Dundee to as far south as Doncaster. He went to Liverpool once, but complained that they couldn't understand what he was saying. And he met two Sunderland sailors who were so relieved to talk to somebody in the same language. I don't think he ever went there again. So mainly it's this side of the Pennines. He went into Cumbria, as we call it now, and he had to not fight, but he had to cope with the Quakers who weren't very keen on what he was doing. Yeah, but he got through in the end. The book dealers wouldn't, the booksellers and the grocers wouldn't put his leaflets up, so he just carried on doing it. Races, fairs, hoppings, yeah, dances, weddings, big weddings, especially big farmers' weddings. One big farmer's wedding had hundreds of people at it, and 20-odd fiddlers and pipers. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
It's called Tosson. Not far from. Where's that? Not far from. Yeah, come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of those up there. I started writing songs that have survived. Now, the first one I think is extremely interesting. You are aware of the High Level Bridge. You're aware it was opened in 1849. You're aware she stopped for 20 minutes to open it. Yeah? And he wrote a song called The Queen's Second Visit, which was as anti-monarchist as you could wish. Yeah? Basically slagging off the Queen and slagging off the Prince as well. The Prince was hugely unpopular. Yeah? Not necessarily for good reasons, but he was unpopular, being German and all. Well, so true. And then he was encouraged by this, and a man called Joseph Philip Robson. Anybody heard of him? No? That's interesting. Had written Billy Purvis's life, because Billy was running out of gigs, basically, yeah? And he needed the money. And he sold 2,000 in a day. Billy, on the streets of Newcastle, yeah? And it was like a part work. It adds up to a full book, and you can bind it together as a book at the end. And there are various editions, and sadly, Frank Graham published the very worst one, which he'd asked me at the time, but he didn't. The best one, they've got a copy in the Central Library. It was written just after Billy died in 1853, because J.P. Robson wanted to cash in this. And that's got most of the detail that I'll be using in my work. So, he does this with the same printer, Clark, in St Nicholas Churchyard. He does this little book called Random Rhymes. It has a suitably green cover. And they have a copy in the Central Library, which they won't exhibit in case it fades, sadly. So you can't see your property. Lots of other things too. And it was dedicated to, and I quote, the skippers, colliers and working men. There's a reason for that. It wasn't that he was necessarily chauvinist, as we would say now. It was they were the only ones who were allowed into licensed premises on most occasions at that point. So he was absolutely clear that his patrons were the working class, or as we would say now, of Tyneside in general. And that's the first. I don't know of any other singer-songwriter of that period who had a working class base that we're absolutely sure about. He's a star. This man's a budding star. 1851. Can you imagine Dire Straits publishing 2 songs on a sheet in support of a strike? With their name on, at their expense, yeah? Or any of the so-called stars of today. Ned did. Ned published 2 songs, one of which is called, my favourite, called £4.10. And basically the strikers in North, it starts in the South Shields and it spreads right down the coast and up the coast, for that matter. And he writes them for propaganda. He says, if ever you want me to write for you, I'll take my pen and write it down. In other words, he was a propagandist well before the ones that we all know, in the States and everywhere else. He was prepared to do it. And he would have paid for it himself. Interestingly, one of the tunes, we might want to discuss this later, it's called Zip Coon. Makes us uncomfortable today, doesn't it? Yeah?
Yeah.
Quite a nice tune. Quite lively, actually. And it just does raise the question about, can we just transpose our values and thoughts and worries back 150 years or not? So I'm going to leave that one hanging until the second half. So let people think about that if they would. And he got married. He married a woman called Isabella Arrowsmith. She was a woman of independent means. That doesn't mean she was, filthy rich. It just means that she hadn't got to work for a living. And she was illiterate. Well-to-do and illiterate at this period, because the literacy rates amongst men and women were quite different, because they weren't the schools for the girls, for the boys, and so on and so forth. 1853. He's been doing all this. Billy is still alive. I think he's still working for Billy at this point. But in February 1853, he gets his big break. Now, Central Station, yeah, portico, looking at it from outside, go along to the nursery, yeah, is it now? Is it opposite before, I think? There's a big stone wall, yeah? Behind that big stone wall was, I'm going to call it, a wooden wigwam. It was built in 1789 for equestrians, horses, yeah? And it was used for circuses time and time again. And he was still there in 1853, and a bloke comes from Sheffield and decides he's going to put on what we would now call Concert Hall. And that's the Royal Olympic Concert Hall. We hope that's where the plaque's going to go, yeah? Not a trace of it left. There isn't a brick left of anywhere where Ned lived. Not a brick. Joe Wilson has a plaque because we know where he was born, yeah? Ned wiped out of history in terms of the urban landscape. He writes this song. It's called the Tune Improvement Bill. You might know this song, because Alex Glasgow used bits of it in Joe Lives in 1971, yeah? And he used it because he wanted to compare those times with T. and Smith. I know this because he told me, yeah? It's obvious anyway, really, wasn't it? And it's another vicious attack on the corporation who are doing the best they can under difficult circumstances, yeah? They're basically taking away the kids' playground to sell it to, wait for it, the railway company. Yeah? So the kids had nowhere to play. He came on stage, he's around 5'10", yeah? Dressed as a boy, trundling a hoop, and asking for the audience's sympathy, and he just was a bomb, yeah? Anti-royal, anti-corporation. Chartism must have been somewhere lurking around here, yeah, even though it isn't mentioned. Certainly the influence or the side effects or the shaping effects of Chartism must have been at work. Another song, which is, again, my second favourite, it's called He Wad Be a Noodle. Do you know what noodles are?
It's the militia.
That's the militia, the voluntary militia. It's interesting, this, because he is regarded as a sibling or a very close relation of the narrator, the singer, yeah? And Ned takes the mickey out of him incredibly, systematically. But he's called Geordie. It's our Geordie, not theirs. It's from inside the class, not from outside the class, yeah? Utterly consistent behaviour. By this time, 1854, Bamburgh's doing really well. His hall now holds 2,000 people. The Royal Olympic holds 2,840. Any one night in Newcastle, potentially, at this point, it gets more later, 5,000 people could be singing. No telly, no films, yeah? Newspapers not particularly relevant to most people. What are you going to do? If you can afford it, you're going to have a good sing, yeah? It's the only reason my father went to chapel. And then he decides to move to Sunderland, partly because of the railways. And there's some sort of an ambiguous comment on the front of his next songbook, well, his second songbook, about some judges somewhere. He's run. It's a quote from Akenside, the worst poet on the planet who comes from Newcastle. Yeah? And it's something about something called slip song, which simply means a simple sheet of paper. And they've done well. So, where's the only copy of this songbook? The obvious place. Bodleian Library. Thank goodness for the internet. I mean, even Keith, who knows about this stuff, yeah, he's been doing this stuff for a never heard of it, Keith. Have you? No. So it's been a closely guarded secret since 1854. Some new songs in there. He put some of his back catalogue in, as we'd say now, yeah, in the middle, so you wouldn't actually notice it. You wouldn't read it first, yeah. And there it is. The printer went bankrupt soon afterwards, but there you are. Life's a jungle. He worked at Bamburgh's, and he worked with somebody called Cedar, C-E-D-A, sometime with an R on the end. Cedar was black. There's a lot of black artists played Newcastle. Yeah. Zip White is my favourite name. Zip. And he writes a song. I'm not even going to apologise for this, but it relates to a point I made earlier. During the Crimean War, the Light Brigade, bless them, had a song of their own called Cheer Boys Cheer. Ned wrote two songs with analogous titles. One of them was Beer Boys Beer, in which he actually slated sponges and scroungers. And the other one praised working people up to the hilt. Sadly, from our point of view, it was called, you probably guessed, Cheer Niggers Cheer. And he will have blacked up. And he uses the word we, yeah? They are working like niggers to amuse you. He's talking about himself. Cedar, I don't know what he might have thought. We can only guess, really, can't we? It was a gig. It relates to our attitudes, not knowing really what the score was then. We don't know what the score was then. Yeah? It's like talking about Jewish people before the Holocaust. It's not the same bloody thing, really, is it? It brings it all into focus. So I thought I'd make you uncomfortable by saying that. And then he went on to produce some cheap songbooks. He had a reason for doing it. It was called the Fairless Arms Music Hall in Wapping Street, South Shields. Don't look for it. The foundations aren't there even. Yeah, you know Wapping Street's like it's where the sailors lived, obviously. Yeah, down by the river there. And he already had a hall. We think it was to the side. It was to the back. I don't know. It was a big bbuilding. It had 18 rooms in it. Big house. And we think we have a photograph of it, but there are two of them. We don't know which one it is. It's a miracle we have a photograph at all. But guess whose money it was that bought this hall? Mrs. Corvan. Yeah. Mrs. Corvan, the illiterate Mrs. Corvan. I know this for Toyenetic why. And Bella Junior, Isabella Junior, they're all called Isabella, you know, at that point. There's only one name for a woman, it was Isabella. In 1857, they had another one called Mary Jane. Now this is problematical. Around this time, he writes lots of songs, one of which I find unpleasant. And never been published until now, it's in here. Right? But it's only him letting off steam, I think. It deals with issues of domestic violence, yeah? But Mary Jane didn't live with them. parents, voice with the mum, a putative dad. So you can weave your own story around that one. Yeah. One of the songs says something to the effect that of course he's just in the right direction, he's distancing himself from it. But she says that my wife's complaining that I'm not up to the job. She's been used to sailors' rations. He got close to it several times without actually naming it. Yeah. And that I'm still convinced that's what happened, because Mary Jane lives with the grandma quite often. Not there really, you know. And relations must have been somewhat strained in the household. So what does Isabella do? She sells the music hall gets a solicitor who can write, presumably, and sells it. And at this point he becomes Jim. This is a self-portrait from around about this time. I think it's done in a mirror, because if you notice he disappears towards the ground a bit. Yeah? That's what happens if you do something in the mirror. And he wrote a song called Catgut Jim, which is basically a song which links lots of tunes together. It's a song about songs. It's like the right term, I think, yeah. And it becomes his signature tune, and he sings it thousands and thousands of times. And then he goes to Hartlepool. Keith.
In former times, it's war and strife, when French invasion threatened life, and all was armoured to the knife. The fisherman hung the monkey on. The fisherman with courage high, has seized that monkey for a spy. Hang him, says one, says another, he'll die. They didn't hung the monkey, oh. Doo-dum, 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 da. Doo-dum, 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 da. Doo-dum, 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 da. The fisherman hung the monkey, oh. They tried every means to make him speak. They tortured him till he loud did squeak. Says French, says one, says another, Greek. The fisherman then got drunky, oh. Is all our hair, some chaps did cry. Is up to something cute and sly. With a cod's head, then they bent his eye. Now actually there's another line in there on the original. What other woman with him would lie? But for some reason Mr. Allen didn't like that, did he? So he left that out. So let's have a chorus in disappropriation of the closing of the ogle of the unfortunate monkey. The fisherman hung the monkey, oh. Some punks fake they did bewail, although speechless he still had his tail. I think that's supposed to be funny. It's probably a Victorian interpretation to have your tail is to tell a story. Shall I do that again? Yes. Some punks fake they did bewail, though speechless he still had his tail. He'd been better off in Durham jail, because the monkey was turning funky, oh, 1850 on. Funky, absolutely. They said he made some curious looks when they shaved his head and cut off his looks, saying that's the sport for French humbugs before they hung the monkey, oh. Oh, doo-doo, 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 the fisherman hung the monkey, oh. I forgot to say that was a chorus in consideration of the total annihilation removal of the monkey's auricular organ and near monkey business. Thank you. Hammer is ripped the thundering thief, Hummer is paid well with your leaf. You know he's born, but no, oh, with grief, his own Napoleon uncle, oh. Thus to him they did behave, cut off his, now it depends which version.
Jimmy.
Oh! Cut off his Jimmy? What does that mean? Well, that was on the original, but it's whiskers in Mr. Allen's book, is it not? And then they cried out, he's never been shaved. They commenced to shave the monkey. That's a bit of modernisation. Let's have the chorus, after the style of a monkey group. Doo-dum, doo-dum, da. Doo-dum, doo-dum, da. They hung the monkey and they hung him up high. Doo-dum, doo-dum, da. I'm singing doo-dum, doo-dum, da. Oh, they went and hung the monkey and they hung him up high. Oh, doo-dum, doo-dum, da. Doo-dum, doo-dum, da. Doo-doo, 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 da. The fisherman on the monkey oar. They want to go down hot. The monkey then quite funny got. He rolled his eyes all the lot. Again he was turning funky old. The fisherman up to the monkey goes, hang him now and end his woes. But the monkey jumped up and bit off his nose before they hung the monkey on. Well, they didn't actually hang him. They bound him up and they bound him in. But he bounded away. Then they bound him up and they bounded him back again, and then they hanged him. Or hung him. You hang a monkey? You hung him. Am I speaking above your heads?
No.
The fisherman hung the monkey on. Now let us hope at land and sea we'll still have sovereignty. Wonderful rhyming that, isn't it? Oh, let us hope at land and sea we shall still have sovereignty. If France and England, I agree, it's not topical, and never get turning funky old. As for poor pug, I've had me say, his time is past for many a day. But in Hartlepool you'll hear folks say, 33 years teaching in Hartlepool, folks, I've got this right. I say, mister, my mother asks me. She asked me to ask you. My mother asked me to ask you to tell me. My mother asked me to ask you to tell me to tell. Who hung the monkey? Oh, the fisherman hung the monkey.
You can't see it. You can have a look there if you'd like to. These are Ned Corvan's songbooks from this period. They're found in the back of J.P. Robson's Songs of the Birds of the Time, 1849. J.P. Robson is regarded very often as a respectable character. He was a school teacher. Went to jail for 2 years. Wrote a racist song about the Irish. Hated Ned Corvan. And he was reciprocated warmly. Yeah? For the rest of their lives, they're having goes at each other and taking lumps out of each other. Yeah? Again, Ned won really, because he's much cleverer. And of course, at this point, I forgot to mention, he's no longer Corvan. He's Corvan. In between, he's been Corvan. Anybody doing ancestry will realise what a nightmare that is. Yeah? Took me literally years to get back to the Corvins. But he's now Corvan. I don't think he invented either of those names. Publishers published them, perhaps by mistake, perhaps by hearing, because they all sound very similar if you say them, Anyway, he's Corvan now. And Edward Corvan Jr., he's born in Sunderland in 1861. So obviously him and his wife are back together again. Because the thought is that he gave his address at Stanbridge for a long time. Yeah? So she may have kicked him out. That's the current theory anyway. Meanwhile, across the pond, we have a civil war. People who don't like civil wars, especially if they're black, leave. Those who are singers and songwriters, where else did they come? They come to Newcastle. Yes? They come all over, actually. And Ned works with him. He was the Geordie the Keelman in the Nigger Ball, would you believe? At the Town Theatre in 1862. But he got a gig back there in spite of his somewhat rakish reputation. He's very fond of whiskey. And the only person we have as evidence of this is, sadly, the leading teetotaler in the northeast of England. He's called Thomas Allen. Have you heard that name? Yeah. And he says he was basically a pisshead. But that's the only evidence of that character. I don't believe a bloody word Thomas Allen says. Somebody who likes to drink and somebody who's a pisshead are two different categories as far as I'm concerned. We'll never know. However, he wrote Hartley Colliery. Remember Hartley Colliery early in 1862? 204 men and boys, single shaft, saving money, no chance. Yeah? Ned writes a song called The Queen Has Sent a Letter. Now, Ed and I don't agree about this. Yeah? Ed thinks it's a piss take. I wish it was. I suspect it wasn't, because he needed the bloody work in the Tyne Theatre. Yeah? But we won't know for sure. It's perfectly legitimate to think it's tongue-in-cheek. Sadly, he loses that job and he doesn't work there ever again. And of course, Thomas Allen has an explanation for that too. Yeah? Basically, he was visiting every night. And he starts selling his songs, manuscript songs, that all the not all the ones, but quite a few of them are in here. They look a bit like that, yeah? He sells them, first of all, for 7 stamps. That's a bit nice. And it goes up to, I think, 15, and it ends with 18 stamps. What's the stamps for? Biting off for gigs. Yeah? You have to get stamps to do that, and it's an easy way of getting paid, and stamp coins and so on. Doesn't last. Got 3 kids, a very demanding wife, according to him. We don't hear her side of the story, yeah? And he's running out of money and he can't get gigs. What's he going to do? The only thing he's got left are his copyrights. Guess who buys his copyrights? Thomas Allen at the station. Yeah? That's why we have them, ironically. Yeah? Because these are in the Allen papers in the Central Library. So it's a bit of a mixed blessing. And then produces, this is the later edition, but this is Thomas Allen's bestseller. This one's 1865, I'll come to it later, but there were two more before this, called Tyneside Songs, basically enough. And the 2 headliners are Corvan and George Ridley. That's what sells this book, that's what makes that man the money. Yes. And of course, George Ridley dies in 1864, doesn't it? So there's only one of them left. So he gets jobs in the Weir Music Hall in Sunderland. That was only a small establishment, held 4,000 people. And eventually that runs out. I mean, he gets quite a decent sort of gigs there, but he has to find out work, and he has to go as far away as Leeds and Dundee to get a job, get any kind of money at all. Late in 1864, he comes back to Newcastle, and he goes to another one, the Granger Concert Hall. It's on the corner of Granger Street and Nelson Street. Yeah? And there's another one in Grey Street called the Victoria, so there's another 1,000, between them, another 1,000 seats, yeah? To add to the 2,800, to add to the 2,000. Where are we now? I've lost track. Yeah? 6,000, 7,000 people. Astonishing. And he gets the mickey taken out of him by some Southerners. Because they can't understand him. It's his fault, not theirs. Yeah? Yeah? So he gets his fiddle out. He plays on the Carnival de Venus by Paganini. Played by Paganini, I should say, not by Paganini, yeah. And he shuts them up. By this time, he was suffering from tuberculosis of the larynx. Please do not Google it. I did, and I wished I hadn't. Yeah? Apparently, you can get tuberculosis anywhere in your body. Yeah? The doctor told me that recently. There's a new star on the block. Banbridge has become the Oxford Music Hall. Yeah? There's a young man called Wilson singing a song called Keep Your Feet Still, Geordie Hinny. You know? Good song, says Ned to a friend, says Mr. Allen. Some lady with Mr. Allen, I think. Yeah? But I'm going to write one that will knock its end in. Sadly, his end went first. It had a benefit for him, and raised some money, and the idea was he would go to the country and try and recover, because as you probably know, you need enormously good food and all kinds of things, and any chance of recovering from tuberculosis, and he wasn't going to be able to do that, was he? Still got the wife and 3 kids, remember, we think. Not so sure about that now, actually, the more I think about it. And he dies, it's a priceless one, he dies in Haddock's Court. I bet nobody's ever heard of Haddock's Court before. You've been to Debenhams, haven't you? Mm-hmm. It's underneath Debenhams, underneath the curved part of Debenhams. And it's so obscure that it's not on the maps. It was a tenement with a block tenant, and I know there's at least 100 dwelling there, because sometime later a woman threw herself from number 101. With suicide, yeah? It was a tenement, the conditions must have been appalling. He dies. And he's looking into Pauper's grave. Well, he's not looking, everybody else is looking at Pauper's grave. And some of his mates get together and get in the top class Pauper's grave. And that involved, I only learned this recently, having a priest, in his case a Catholic priest, sort of say a few words over it. You want to see it today, you can go and see it. That's me and Ned's great grandson, Joe Wilkes. You see that slight indentation in the tarmac path? Guess who's under there? Yeah. Ned. It's absolute disgrace to this city. Absolute disgrace. That's where he is. And of course his widow had to struggle after. And she did. Guess who bought the songs that she had left from her late husband? Thomas Allen. Thomas Allen is what I call my East Cleveland accent, what's left of it, a hearse chaser. Yeah. He'd done exactly the same to George Ridley, and he was about 10 years later doing exactly the same to Julius. Yeah? When they're hard up, when they're weak, when they're vulnerable, when they're sick, when they're dying, when they're desperate, those songs make a lot of money. Smile and be benevolent. I wanted to swear there, but I didn't know as good, wasn't I? And so more of these keep coming out, yeah? Tyneside songs. Tyneside songs. They were still selling them after Thomas Allen died in 1894, yeah? Ridley's and Corvan songs. And then there's what happens next. Well, basically what happens next is the music hall diverges. The respectable national circuits, well capitalised. In our case, the Tyne Theatre Opera House, yeah? Joseph Cowan's money, Joseph Cowan's bricks on the front, those white bricks, yeah? And the smaller ones which eventually fade away into nothingness. Big capital moves in. Ned Pierce died. Famous one was Billy Thompson, who was the chairman at the Oxford. And he was very large, very rude, and very popular. But he died in 1869. J.P. Robson dies in 1870. Not a minute too soon for me. And then Edward Corvan Jr. gets into trouble. He's a shoplifter, South Shales. And they put him on the Wellesley. Have you heard of the Wellesley? Yeah. The training ship for naughty boys. Yeah. And ironically, he has to make sales that trade his father money. And it's moored just off North Shields, where his parents lived as a couple early in their married life. Yeah. Really, really, really strange. Bella Jr. goes on the stage. Becomes a music hall singer. Vocalist, as they called it then. Yeah. And she does very well. She gets as far as Belfast. She goes to Edinburgh. She goes to Glasgow. She goes very much further south than Yorkshire. Then she gets married, and that stops because she weren't allowed to do that if you know. Basically, it's more and more of the same of that until you get to 1890 when you've all got copies of Aaron's Tyneside songs and take it all, you've seen them, yeah? 25 of Ned's songs in there, more than anybody else, by a long shot. Still getting money out of them. I mean, Thomas was to die 3 years later, but his sons went on to carry on taking them. 1901, Bella dies, breast cancer. Leaves 4 kids. The youngest one, Samuel, is Joe's dad. We're that close. When Joe was little, his auntie used to tell him all these stories about Ned Corvan. And he's forgotten them. And he didn't write them down. And he's kicking himself up and down there. So he's not very pleased about this, obviously. Yeah. And the last one, my least favourite human being on the planet, Catchside Warrington. His fellow Freemasons called him Catchy. He tried to diddle his fellow Freemasons. He had been a musical performer. If you listen to his records, it's like something from another planet, really. And it's posh Geordie with knobs on, yeah? Awful. But he got the job thanks to John Gale Windows of Windows Music Shop of editing and arranging the songs he chose. Where did he get them from? Thomas Allen's Tyneside songs. Now, Thomas Allen had changed lots of his songs. Don't trust any of the lyrics in that book. What does Catchy do? He changes them again. And Mrs. Versailles and on all kinds of things like that. People who think they have a grip of Tyneside song culture on the basis of those 2 books are in the cloud cuckoo, quite frankly. It's not the original stuff. And that's come as a bit of a shock to some singers because they're sort of used to it, yeah? Grandma had Catchside Warrington the piano too, yeah? I've got a copy of the original Tyneside songs and all that kind of thing. To some people, it's the world upside down. But the key thing is this, I think. You'll say what you feel, but surely I will. People recorded George Ridley's songs on records, on wax cylinders originally, yeah? Nobody recorded Ned's. The first recording of Ned, I know, was done in the obvious place in 1944, just across the river from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And in the 50s, Dennis Weatherly recorded some for the BBC. Yeah? And the BBC put them in a skip afterwards. Somebody, I will not name them, somebody found these tapes and issued them as recordings. I'll let you guess who that might have been. I'm not going to name it, yeah? And since then, there have been only 6 of Ned's songs recorded. He wrote at least 120. I found out there are over 100 in here. All the ones I know are in here. Yeah, lyrics are in here. And 23 artists have recorded various versions of these 6 songs, and 11 of them have been reissued by the same person who found the tape. Yeah? Why so few? One question I'd like to know your opinions about. Why hasn't Ned got a plaque yet? This is a bit naughty, but why has a socialist from Yorkshire got to write this book?